Thank you very much. Right, we have tonight Chris Hodrian to talk to us about the K Class submarines of the First World War. I will just tell you a little bit about our speaker, as provided very kindly by himself. He's by profession is a chemical engineer from the energy industry and now lives in Solihull. He graduated from Cambridge in 1973, spent a long research and development career with British Gas, and now works as a part-time international energy and process consultant and university lecturer, including the exciting new green energy field of carbon capture from energy plants. Chris has been active in the steam preservation and industrial archaeology field ever since 1970, and was a very early member of the National Association for Industrial Archaeology, the AIA. He's a co-founder and technical advisor of the International Stationary Steam Engine Society, ISSES. I'd be careful not to call it ISIS nowadays, but...
Yes, it's a bit unfortunate. We're thinking about rebranding.
Which also covers marine steam plant. He has occasionally acted as an industrial archaeology consultant and researcher. Chris has also had a lifelong amateur interest in military history. So growing up in Portsmouth, an interest in naval history came naturally. So when Chris came upon the first popular book about the K Class in the 1970s, and another more recently on earlier submarine development, his interest was sparked, leading to further research on this extraordinary naval and technological saga. This talk is based on a detailed paper which Chris produced for the ISSES journal Stationary Power in 2002. He's previously given a number of talks to our branch. He's spoken on the Leffler boiler system and the Babcock and Wilcox boilers, and he did actually give this lecture on the K Class submarines to us about 10 years ago, but we think it's such an interesting story, we think it's worth giving again, and there's probably enough of you that didn't manage to see it hear it the first time round. So, Chris, would you like to tell us all about the K Class submarines?
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Oh, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking here again. Quick show of hands, how many people heard of the K Class, the existence of the K Class in World War I before you saw this? Oh, quite a few of you, actually. Okay, fair enough. So, yeah, news is spreading slowly. It was actually a highly suppressed topic for many decades. So, just first to get started, I'd like to make a few acknowledgements. Firstly, to the late Don Everett, who wrote the first popular book on this subject in 1963, which I used for a lot of my research information. Secondly, to my colleague Paul Stevens, who's the chairman of our ISSES Society. Paul very kindly spent many hours in the the archives department at the Royal Naval Submarine Museum at Gosport, winkling out some of the illustrations I'm going to be showing you tonight. The last time I gave this talk, we had E.F. Clarke, the past president of Newcombe Society, in the audience, and his father actually served in this dreadful class of submarines in the early 1920s, not under war conditions, thank goodness. And so a few of the photos have come from his family. And finally, is Chris Barney here from the AA? Oh, you made it, Chris. Well done. Hi. We must have a talk afterwards. Chris's uncle helped build these things in 1917-ish? Yeah. And briefly served in one of the ones you're going to hear about, and fortunately escaped. Right. I'll just start with 3 quotes from the various books. Firstly, Lord Jackie Fisher, Battleship Fisher, in June 1913. The most fatal error ever imaginable would be to put steam engines into a submarine. Secondly, retired Rear Admiral Lear, speaking in 1961, the only good thing about the K-boats was that they never engaged the enemy. And retired Commander Bradshaw in 1959, I never met anybody in the Navy who had the least affection for the K-Class. They were looked on with fear and loathing. After all, they murdered many of their officers and crews. Now, this story reads like a racy novel with an improbable plot, but it happens to be all true. So if you are as intrigued as I was by this preposterous tale, I can recommend 2 specific books, and you can get the references from me at the end, one of them by Everett, as I mentioned. And also, there is the ISSES journal, where this article is available in detailed form. I'm afraid I don't have any with me for direct sale tonight, which is an oversight, but if anyone wants to leave me their personal details, I'll get you in touch with how to get hold of one. Right. So one of the greatest continuing secrets of the Royal Navy from World War I was the creation and deployment of the 17 giant steam turbine-powered submarines of the K Class. Initially, in 1915, they were built in conditions of great secrecy as a new secret weapon. Subsequently, they were so disastrous in service that an effective cover-up prevented most public knowledge of their existence even into the 1960s. And it's only as recently as 1990 there was a memorial to any of the dead crew anywhere. Now, I understand that most sailors are superstitious, and submariners especially so. The K-Class gained a fearsome reputation among their crews. They simply became known as the Suicide Club. Of the original 17 built, no less than 8 of the class sank, none of them in action, and several in mysterious circumstances, 6 of them with almost total loss of the crew, and not a single one of the class escaped hazardous mishaps of one sort or the other. One, numbered K13, what a surprise, sank on the very day of its acceptance sea trial. At a fantastic night training exercise in the Firth of Forth, which became known informally as the Battle of Mayallen, I'll be discussing this incident in detail towards the end, 2 of the class were sunk and 6 of them were damaged, so that's nearly half the whole class in a single night within about an hour. Overall, this class killed hundreds of Royal Navy submariners with not a single torpedo fired in action. All right.
There was one engagement where one K-Class fired 2 torpedoes, one missed, the other hit, it was a good.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Perhaps we can talk about that afterwards. Okay. So at first glance, putting conventional steam power into the submarine may sound like madness. It sounds like something dreamed up by Monty Python, doesn't it? But before you snigger too much, just remember that all the tremendously successful strategic nuclear submarines of today, ever since 1960, are all powered by condensing steam turbine systems. They just have a nuclear kettle. This power system allows these remarkable vessels to stay submerged and undetected for patrols as long as 6 months, circumnavigating the entire globe. Now let's go back to 1915. Submarine power plants were still a relatively immature technology. Now, in the case of stationary power plant at the time, we take it for granted that everything was steam powered, right up to the largest power stations. And reciprocating engines usually at that, typically. So steam was the technology of choice for both stationary power and for all large naval surface ships at the time. And this logic also applied to submarines. Now, for reasons that will be explained a bit later, the Admiralty specification in 1915 called for a surface speed of 21 knots, whereas the highest speed so far achieved by diesel engine submarines in the Royal Navy was only 15 knots. Right, now I'm going to divert. Before we look at the K-Class, I'm going to have a quick romp through the submarine's development history before 1914. We'll look at the prehistory. Now, actually, this is such an interesting topic. It could be the subject for a paper in its own right. The genesis of the submarine goes back many centuries further than often realised. Now, I've asked lots of people this question, and nobody ever gets it. The first known attempt, recorded attempt, at an underwater attack was Alexander the Great at the Siege of Tyre in 332 BC, where they attempted to use diving bells to undermine the walls. In the 4th century AD, a Roman author gave detailed descriptions of several designs of diving suit. A diving bell was constructed by the famous English astronomer Edmund Halley in 1690. This was used for attempts at ship salvage, and you can see a full-scale replica of this down at the Naval Submarine Museum at Gosport. The first documented powered submarine known to have been actually built was designed by a Dutchman called Cornelius Drebbel in London in 1620 in the reign of King James I. It's built of wood covered with oil leather, it's egg-shaped, and has a crew of about 10 powered with oars through flexible rubber grommets. Or leather grommets, I should say. It is alleged that James I was taken for a ride in the Thames in this beast and even briefly submerged. Now, the thing on the right is a replica, which at the time of the photograph, 2006 I think, was in a courtyard in Richmond, fairly close to the river. I'm told it's now been moved, but it is around somewhere. Okay. Drebbel is credited with having devised this submarine in between inventing the thermometer, a magic lantern projector, a refrigeration device, of course a perpetual motion machine, and of also introducing both the telescope and the microscope into England. He was effectively the King's chief scientist. Dennis Papin did a design exercise for a submarine in 1690. Nathaniel Simons of Totnes demonstrated one in the River Dart in 1729, which also had a diver airlock, so as a diver could leave. John Day of Plymouth lost his life in a wagered diving demonstration in Plymouth Harbour in 1774 in a 50-ton wooden sloop with all the holes sealed up, except one wasn't. But now I want to move on to a much more famous device, which is this fella, Bushnell's turtle. This is the American Civil War. It's 1776. We're about at the signing of the Declaration, the American Declaration. It's a wooden, egg-shaped one-man attack submarine, which is designed to attack the British warships who are engaged in blockade of the American ports. As you can see on the back, it has a large detachable demolition charge. And the idea is, if you look just above the captain's face, there is a screw auger. So the idea is you creep up underneath this wooden ship, you screw your auger in, you then detach your charge and it hangs on a string from this auger, and then you retreat to a safe distance and there's a timer in the charge. That's the idea. So he carried out 3 abortive attempts to sink the English frigate HMS Eagle in New York Harbour in 1776, the first known submarine attack. It wasn't successful, unfortunately, because he'd ignored physics. If you've got a socking great 500-ton wooden battleship and you come up to the thing this size and you try and screw a screw into the bottom of the battleship, guess what happens? You get pushed downwards instead of the screw going into the wood. So he couldn't attach the screw. Apart from that, everything had worked fine. He got underneath this battleship undetected. Now look at the propulsion system. We've got 2 Archimedes screws here, one for forward propulsion and one for diving. This is 24 years before the invention of the conventional ship propeller. It's a screw. It also includes a self-sealing breathing snorkel just behind the diver's shoulder, a squat conning tower top, and luminous instrument dials. Not bad for 1776. Right, now a lot of you will... Oh, sorry, here's an illustration of a full-scale replica which is to be found in the Museum of Oceanography in Monaco, taken by my colleague Chris Allen. Now we'll look at this piece. Now a lot of you have heard of Robert Fulton. He is often regarded as the father of the steamboat, or one of the 3 fathers of the steamboat. He built the first steamboats in the USA in the early years of 1805. What's not known is before he was developing steamboats, he was building man-powered submarines, and here is one. This is the vessel he called the Nautilus. It was built for real in 1800. It's powered by 2 men operating a hand crank. Can you see the hand crank in the middle there? That's driving a propeller. So this is a propeller-powered vessel in 1800. Think about it. Now, he offered his services as a mercenary to the French Navy. France is at war with Britain at this time. Surprise, surprise. We're right in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. So before he started developing steamboats in America, he goes to France and he offers to build and crew submarines for the French Navy to attack British Navy battleships off the French coast and to blockade the Thames. And he offers to do this on a commercial mercenary basis, paid per ship sunk. So this is a remarkable, this blockade bit of this strategy is a remarkable premonition of the German U-boat strategy of both World Wars. He's way ahead of his time here. Now, this is much more recognisable to us as a modern submarine. First, the construction. It's built of copper sheets on iron ring frames. It's 20 feet long. It has a hemispherical forward pressure bulkhead inside here. Can you see it's about a quarter of the way back? It's got a streamlined hull. It has 2 propulsion mechanisms, a sail for surface and a propeller for underwater. So we've already got the divided drive propulsion system for submarines we're so familiar with today. And this propeller is 50 years before SS Great Britain, or nearly 50 years. Okay. And like the Turtle, it carries an externally mounted explosive charge, which is that little thing sitting on the back there, this sort of satchel, and the idea is you spike into the enemy's hull and do it. So in 1801, Nautilus 2, now upgraded to 4 crew, was sea tested at Brest submerging for 4.5 hours using breathing air for compressed air cylinders, so they're already doing that. That's a first. And in August of 1801, the world's first ever offensive ambush patrol was mounted along the French coast. No British ships were sighted. By the end of 1801, after 15 different attempts to persuade the French Navy to build a fleet of these at their own expense, he gave up. It is just fascinating to speculate on the outcome if every French ship at the Battle of Trafalgar had been carrying one of these things. So he crossed over and tried selling his wares to the enemy, the British, as you do. So the Admiralty strategically recognised that submarines could upset the current status quo of global domination by the British Navy. This would occur again during the development of the torpedo boat by Thornycroft in London in 1872. You know, you've got a global navy that depends on the power of its battleships, and along comes a disruptive technology that's going to render the battleships useless. So quite remarkably, Fulton was paid off by the British government the colossal sum of £15,000, that was a lot of money in 1801, to keep his secrets unused. So that is where Fulton got his money to develop the American steamboats with. Now, amazingly, shortly afterwards, an American called Captain Johnson speculatively built a submarine on the River Thames, quite close to the Duke of Wellington's house, for the express purpose of rescuing Napoleon from St. Helena. But Napoleon unsportingly died before it was completed. Sometime before 1840, a Frenchman called de Montgery, in a thesis, was the first to propose mechanical propulsion by engines. He proposed to build a huge vessel 112 feet long with 125 crew, which was going to be named Invincible. And he was already suggesting both steam engines for surface use and compressed gas motors for submerged drive. So you can see here in 1840 the first glimmerings of the K-Class concept. As we'll see later, the French were once again in a leading position on submarine development about 1890 to 1900. Now we dive off into all sorts of other inventors. So in 1850, Wilhelm Bauer builds a 26-foot-long submarine called Le Plongeur Marin at Kiel. This is a propeller powered by manual capstans, much like Nautilus here. On its first trial in Kiel Harbour, it nosedived to 59 feet, and the crew were trapped for 5 hours, eventually making the first known underwater submarine escape. When German funding dried up, he built a second submarine in Britain, another turncoat, with some design involvement by Brunel, Scott Russell, and Charles Fox. He was very suspicious of his partners and refused to patent his design to avoid disclosing his secrets. When the English interest petered out, he obtained Russian funding. So in 1855, at the height of the Crimean War, he completes a more ambitious vessel, Le Diable Marin, the Sea Devil, at St. Petersburg. This is an enormous contraption. It's 52 feet long with a crew of 13, by far the largest submarine then built. It's driven by a 7-foot diameter propeller powered by 2 4-man capstans. It has a diver's airlock for the diver to leave and attach limpet mines to the enemy ships. He proved this design with 134 demonstration dives. He made a paper design for a still larger submarine that was going to be armed with 24 waterproof guns and a compressed air system for submerged running. But when the Russians invited him to move his development centre to Siberia, he carefully took the hint and left. Professor Marie Davy in 1854 proposed and tested as a model a battery electric motor for submerged drive. Now just think Faraday a minute. This is not long after Faraday's discoveries, and somebody's already tinkering around with motors for submerged drive, foreseeing the principle used in most diesel submarines to this day. The Crimean War, and especially the siege of Sebastopol, was a spark for a whole range of new designs. Scott Russell's design, based on Bauer's, sank, killing all the crew. Babbage proposed a submarine with a triangular cross-section. Deschamps in France offered a one-man commando submarine. A Russian called Spiridonov proposed a submarine driven by an engine using compressed air provided by hose from a surface ship. And then we find our friend Mr. Naismith. You know the steam hammer man? Well, here's Naismith's design for a coal-fired reciprocating steam-powered submarine. So it's got a vertical single-cylinder engine there, just behind the Scotch-type boiler. He proposed this was going to be 70 feet long, and you see there's a rather thick surrounding. That's 10 feet thickness of wooden armour plating. It's a return tube boiler, and the intended design speed was 10 knots, and again the armament was to be a detachable demolition charge, which is this thing B on the bow here. Now, as early as 1863, this is at the time of the American Civil War, an inventor called Alstit in the States built this large thing. It's the first with 2 modes of mechanical power. It has an inverted compound steam engine for surface drive, and it has a pair of electric motors. This is the time of the Civil War, gentlemen, for powering it underwater to a large propeller. It's a direct progenitor of the K Class in terms of the propulsion system. It's got a telescopic retractable boiler funnel working through a waterproof hatch. The eventual fate of this vessel is not known, but it never entered active service. Now, the first serious attempt at submarines for warfare since Bushnell's Turtle are this pair. This is the height of the Civil War, and this is the Confederates trying to get one over on the Yankees. So first we're going to look at the top of the thing called the David. Now, these 2 drawings are not to scale. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to rescale them before I came out. The top one's 35 feet long and the bottom one's 55 feet long. We'll come to the bottom one in a minute. The David, nicknamed after David and Goliath, actually attempted a night attack on the northern battleship, the flagship of the fleet, Ironsides, with a 60-pound spar torpedo. Well, what's a spar torpedo? The torpedo, as a name, does not mean something that runs through the water by itself with a propeller. A torpedo, as named, means a bomb on the end of a stick. So you basically charge up to your opponent, you spike this bomb into its hull, you detach it and retreat to a safe distance and let it off. So it's a direct ramming attack. Now, it's the same system, believe it or not, was used in the first generation of torpedo boats a few years before the Whitehead self-running torpedo came along. Now, unfortunately, they were spotted approaching the warship, and their officer in the top was killed by rifle fire. They succeeded in attaching their charge, retreated to what they thought was a safe distance. They left the top hatch open to see what was going on. So, of course, when the charge went off, they were swamped by the resulting wave and had to abandon ship. But it did not sink, much to their amazement. An hour later, the engineer returned, got back on board, relit the boiler, and trundled home. They didn't succeed in sinking the ship, but it was an attack. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the south, a gentleman called Hunley and McClintock created 3 prototypes, and they're like this at the bottom. Now, what they've done, they've taken the equivalent of a Lancashire boiler, they've chopped it in half along the middle, and they've inserted extra plates about a foot high, so the thing's slightly deeper than it's broad, so as there's room for people to stand inside, or nearly stand inside. So it was originally a 25-foot long, 4-foot diameter boiler, and they've given it an extra foot of height to give an oval cross-section. So a hand crankshaft driven by 4 cranks runs along the length of this thing. This is 1863. This is a modern computer graphic impression of it. We'll see the real beast in a moment. This thing in the foreground is the spar torpedo. There. You can see it has a proper conning tower for navigation. So if you move on a bit, here's a little montage of photographs. So the top right is a contemporary engraving of the beast when it was in its building dock. On the right is a modern computer graphics cross-section showing the 8 crew at their big crank to directly turn the propeller. And at the bottom is an accurate replica that's at Charleston Museum. How do we know it's an accurate replica? Because the original was found in Charleston Harbour in 1995 and was raised in 2000 and is now on show. Now, this carried out the world's first known successful submarine attack on the 17th of February 1864. It attacked the brand new northern battleship Housatonic with a 90-pound spar torpedo and succeeded in sinking it. She was spotted on the way in because she didn't dive very deep. You know, she was breaking surface with the conning tower. She was spotted, and the Housatonic found to their horror that when they depressed their guns, their main armament would not depress low enough to get at it. They could only depress down to the horizontal, as with most battleships. And neither could they get up steam in time to run away. They could easily have outposted the submarine, but unfortunately they weren't in steam at the time. Sadly, the Hunley also sank during the retreat. Her wreck was finally located, I say, in 1995. There was a detailed programme about it on BBC TV in 2006. Meanwhile, the North responded. They built 2 vessels of the David type, called Spuyten de Ville and Stromboli. Now we come on to, they're still at it. People are still developing and playing around with man-powered submarines to this day. Every 2 years there is an international competition, usually held down at the base at Portsmouth, to see who's got the fastest single man-powered submarine. So people are still playing with this concept. Right, now I want to move on to this brute. We're going to talk about the Reverend Garrett and his hopefully named submarine Resurgam, I Will Rise Again. This is 1878, so we're looking at about 30 years before World War I. This is the Reverend George William Garrett of Manchester. It's the Reverend's strike again with weapon systems. He studied science at Manchester. He got a BA from Dublin in 1875. Now, he initially took a great interest in artificial breathing research. He developed a clear idea that the two key problems for successive submarine design were a means of prolonging breathing underwater for the crew and a suitable underwater power source. So within 3 years of his graduation, he'd invented a complete chemically based underwater scuba set for divers. It was called the Pneumatophore. It was patented and a company was founded under that name to market it. He tested the diving suit personally for 2 hours, so he is a little bit before Commander Cousteau. Also, in May 1878, he took out a provisional patent specification for submarine boats for placing torpedoes, etc. Now, his original design was a little one-man fella called the Egg, which was only about 12 feet long, powered by foot treadles, or a small spark ignition gas engine. The Egg was built in only 4 months by the famous Cochrane Boiler Company at Birkenhead, and it had an iron plate hull on angle iron frames, and the operator could actually extend his arms through external rubber gauntlets out into the sea to do things like place charges. This vessel was funded entirely privately by Garrett's father, but in the second half of 1878 he formed the Garrett Submarine and Pneumatophore Company to raise capital. Given that two reverends were proposing a weapons system, they decided on some self-justification. So the publicity pamphlets, which survive, say, "As to the invention for murdering people, this is all nonsense. Every contribution by science to improve instruments of war makes war shorter and so less terrible." Wonderful, isn't it? These modern politicians have got nothing on spin. Right, okay. So following the successful trials of the Egg, Garrett then built his full-scale design, and this is it. This was built at Cochrane's in November 1879 for about £1,500. It's 40 feet long, it's biconical as you can see, about a 6.5 foot diameter centre section, about 90% of which is full of boiler, which makes it fairly uncomfortable for the crew. It's got a 3-bladed propeller, twin rudders above and below, and it has diving hydroplanes. You can see them in plan here. This is probably the first vessel that has proper diving hydroplanes, because one of the big problems, of course, is how do you control your depth underwater? The idea appears to be that you operate it at full speed on the surface and then literally use the hydroplanes to initially force it underwater. Now, of course, there are problems with any submarine as the fuel gets used up, and it's a particular problem with coal. You've got 2.5 tons of coal fuel on board, so during a journey, if you use it up, you're going to have 2.5 tons of extra buoyancy to suppress to get underwater. It's got a 6 horsepower condensing 8-inch diameter horizontal return rod engine. You can see it there, and you can see it in plan here. The boiler's got a water capacity of 3 tons. And to give you a clear idea, here's a model of what the thing would look like in 3D. You can see it's got some external wooden cladding on the centre section, and you can see it's got a saucer conning tower arrangement. Now, this boiler is designed as a steam accumulator boiler to give increased endurance underwater, and that's why it's so big. But as I say, this has 2 problems. One is that the crew are going to fry because they're cooped up in this box that's 90% full of boiler. And secondly, if there's any kind of incident and you need to get out, you're going to have great fun getting out in a hurry past this thing. Right. Now, the steam engine, the steam system, is an elegant combined surface and submerged propulsion system, and he's using the heat storage principle, the thermal accumulator principle. So this was derived from the famous LAM steam tram system, introduced in New Orleans in 1872, only 6 years previously, and by Frank in Paris the same year, 1878. So given the technology of the time, this is an elegant, logical propulsion system. It avoids duplicating a separate underwater propulsion system. but of course it's going to be appalling for the crew down there. There's a pressurised stokehold system as well for introducing the combustion air when you're on the surface. The top pressure is 150 psi. So just before you dive, you bank the fire up, you seal up the furnace and the ash doors, and then it operates underwater as a fowler's accumulator, and it could deliver its rated 6 horsepower down to a pressure of 30 psi and a reduced output below that. Oh, the third problem I didn't mention is with something hot in the middle, you're going to get condensation all over the inside of the hull. Now, Garrett was somewhat overconfident. He decided that the Resurgam's maiden voyage was to be an epic, unescorted run all the way from Birkenhead around the Welsh coast to Portsmouth Dockyard to show her off to the Admiralty. So they set off from the Albert Dock at Birkenhead. This is a genuine photograph. It is not a Monty Python mock-up, trust me. On the 10th of December 1879, into a dark and misty night in the middle of the busy sea lane of the River Mersey. This does not seem a very good start to me. Sailing hazardously westward in thick fog the next day, they got as far as Rhyl after 36 hours. Clearly, the systems can't have worked very well because the Rutland foundry was then employed to make several new parts over the next 2 months. They set off again in February. Unfortunately, this time they got a small tender. They got a small steam yacht. Disaster rapidly followed. The yacht developed trouble with her boiler feed pump. So all 3 of the crew, not a good start, left the submarine to come and deal with the steam yacht. The weather rapidly deteriorated and the tow rope broke and the top hatch was open, and they sat there on their steam yacht watching their pride and joy sink beneath the waves, which is where it remained, lost on the seabed, until it was found by sport divers in 1995. It's now a registered protected wreck site, and a trust has been formed to lobby for raising and preserving her. In the meantime, you can go and see this, which is a mock-up wooden replica. This is at the Woodside Ferry at Birkenhead, you know, ferry across the Mersey, all that. So in May 1880, Garrett is in Paris demonstrating his breathing apparatus by doing a live demonstration in the Seine for 45 minutes. This too failed to produce any orders, so in 1880 the company also sank. Garrett wasn't to remain unemployed for long. He became an engineer on the construction of Milford Haven docks. Then in early 1881 he met the prominent Swedish arms dealer Garrett and Nordenfelt in London, and Garrett soon got Nordenfelt enthused about the promise of naval submarines. So they agreed a partnership with Nordenfelt providing all the finance and the facilities, but Nordenfelt insisted that any resultant products would carry his name rather than Garrett's. So they actually constructed 4 joint so-called Nordenfelt submarines, all of different designs, between 1882 and 1888. So let's have a look at one. This is Nordenfelt 1, which was built for Greece in 1883. It's a direct descendant of Resurgam with a more streamlined hull. She's 64 feet long. She has a 100 horsepower crank overhead steam engine. You can see it in section there. And you can see she has 2 large steam accumulators fore and aft. She also has a retractable conning tower, an air snorkel, and a patented automatic fore and aft trim control. And there was even an attempt to provide automatic depth control by linking a seawater pressure diaphragm to the main engine control valve to automatically control the steam throttle for the diving engine. To increase underwater range, there were 2 large boiling accumulators totaling 8 tons of water, and that gave her a range of 150 miles at 8 knots on the surface, which was an unbroken record for several years, and 16 miles at 7 knots underwater. She was demonstrated to the Swedish royal household and the government in September 1885 in Landskrona to 39 assorted European VIPs, including the Prince of Wales. He recommended back home that the Royal Navy should purchase one, but that request fell on deaf ears, and so it was purchased by Greece for offensive use against their old friends Turkey. Garrett personally sailed her 400 miles to Copenhagen. She was then dismantled into parts at Burmester and Wain's works and shipped in parts by sea to Greece. And Garrett then personally reassembled her at Piraeus and obtained a commission in the Greek Navy. So the timing was good. The Whitehead self-operating torpedo had just been invented and perfected. And so by fitting this with a Whitehead compressed air torpedo, and 2 Nordenfelt machine guns, this now became the first submarine with a really effective weapon system. He ran a British naval blockade at night in 1886, this is a Brit, outrunning the Royal Navy, to deliver her to the naval base at Salamis. This is still 30 years before World War I, remember. Now, the situation was great for Nordenfelt, because as soon as the Greeks had one, well, of course, the Turks wanted one too. Oh, this is the engine of the Greek one. It's a vertical duplex. You can see the main crankshaft across the back there, much like a paddle steamer engine. So here's Nordenfelt 2 and 3. So Turkey had to have one too. So Turkey goes and orders two larger 100-footers, 160 tons in 1886. They were both built in Britain under subcontract, one by Barrow and one by Davines at Chertsey on the Thames, both with 250 horsepower engines by Plenty. So if you want to see what putting a steam engine into a submarine actually looks like, here's a works photograph from Plenty's Works in Newbury. In 1886, shoehorning a condensing marine-type compound into a submarine. Now, these vessels suffered from alarming fore-aft trim problems underwater because nobody had thought about the problem of the large quantity of water sloshing around in these big accumulators. You start tilting and the water in the accumulators goes the same way. So the Turkish vessels were shipped in 1886 and relaunched in Istanbul in September of that year, named Abdul Hamid in honour of the Sultan, and demonstrated for 5 hours on the Golden Horn. Garrett, in a letter to the Sultan, described it as the best submarine torpedo boat in the world. A member of the crew later described the trim problems. She was perpetually working up and down like a scale beam. No human vigilance could keep her on an even keel for half a minute at a time. Once, and we believe only once, she fired a torpedo, with the result that she, as near as possible, stood up vertically on her tail and plunged to the bottom stern first. The loss of the weight of the torpedo added to the positive buoyancy already established, and she would breach to the surface, or at least the bow-ward surface, which in the middle of an attack on an enemy ship would be rather imprudent. Anyway, clearly things went badly in these trials. Well, you've just heard some of the bad. Because in a remarkable secret letter which survives, Garrett offered to forgo half the contract purchase price for the two submarines in return for their acceptance and one more order. And he then offered his services to the Turkish Navy free of charge for a month to crew it. The boats were never used operationally, as the Turks had great difficulty finding volunteer crews. I wonder why. So by 1909, they were lying disused. Now, Nordenfelt, in the meantime, was thinking big. So this is his Russian boat of 1886. This is a much bigger thing. It's 125 feet long, with a completely different hull shape. There's two modern-style reloadable Whitehead torpedo tubes in the front there, with spares, so much as we're used to with submarines today, with opening caps on the torpedo tubes. And this is powered by a pair of 500 horsepower Plenty compounds. And you can see the sort of size of the boiler plant. So this thing was, it had a range of 2,500 miles, which was pretty spectacular for the time. She was sailed 500 miles from Barrow to Southampton, which at the time was a world record run for a submarine, to demonstrate her to the Admiralty. She maintained 5 knots with a peak of 8 knots, just submerged, and a very creditable 14 knots on the surface. Perhaps not surprising, given there was 1,000 horsepower of engine in the vessel. She became known as the Southampton boat, and she took part in the famous or infamous Queen Victoria Jubilee Naval Review at Spithead in 1887. You remember one where there was this boat called Turbinia, went past everybody. Only Nordenfelt were there by permission. And she attracted very favourable press comment, and the danger she posed to battleships was well recognised. Anyway, the Royal Navy decided not to buy, so it ended up being bought by the Russians. Now, in 1888, the US Navy entered the fray and sponsored a competition for a submarine design. Nordenfelt and Garrett entered, but they were beaten by an Irish-American called Holland. And that ended the Garrett-Nordenfelt partnership. Garrett left for a new life in America in 1890, still only 35. He managed a whole string of temporary jobs, including deckhand, a US Army engineer, and a railroad fireman, and finally died at age 47. As a postscript, the Barrow Shipbuilding Company was renamed the Naval Construction Company, and Nordenfelt merged with Maxim's. And both firms were then taken over by their steel supplier, Vickers, who have supplied submarines from Barrow ever since. So it was noted at the time, around 1888, that all the powers in Europe, except England and Germany, interesting, are now studying the submarine subject exceedingly seriously. England is under the impression that she does not require them because she has such a powerful surface navy. Now, there are many other designs I don't have time to talk about tonight, but I want to talk a bit more about Holland. Now, J.P. Holland was born in Ireland in 1841, and he'd already sketched out a design for a little one-man submarine in his youth. He emigrated to the USA in 1872 and eventually obtained funding for building submarines to attack the British from the Irish Fenian Skirmishing Fund. That's the prototype of the IRA in New York. What his backers had in mind was transporting these across to Ireland as deck cargo and then using them against the British in coastal waters. So in 1877, he launched a 10-foot-long vessel at the Albany Ironworks in New York with a 4-horsepower petrol engine, first IC engine in a submarine, and then a 31-foot-long 3-man version, which he called the Fenian Ram. This had a 15-horsepower petrol engine and a 9-inch compressed air underwater gun poking through the top of the hull, which could lob a shot for 130 feet. The vessel was only used for tests and then beached, apparently after financial theft by one of the financiers. After several more slides came the massive 85-foot Holland 1, also known as Plunger 1, of 1897. Now, this is a serious vessel now. It's by the Holland Torpedo Boat Company. It was the winning entry in the 1888 US Navy submarine design competition, and it was finally launched in 1897. It's got 2 independent triple expansion steam engines, giving a total over 1,600 horsepower, powered from 5 oil-fired water tube boilers, very early use of oil for boiler fuel, this. And this massive power gives it a surface speed of 16 knots, and there are 200 horsepower electric motors for submerged drive. The planned steam power system was actually superseded by petrol engines while it was still under construction, but she was never completed because she was superseded by a new design that was about half the size, 54 feet long, which was the New Holland, as it's so called, which had a 45 horsepower petrol engine. The US Navy purchased her in 1900, and she entered service as the USS Holland in June, which was the start of the American submarine service. And the US Navy ordered a further 7, which were all in use by 1903. Now, at this stage, France, the USA and Russia are far ahead in submarines globally, and Britain and Germany, interestingly, are far behind. The Royal Navy were only just realising that the time of the submarine had finally come, and they could not simply wish it away. So there was an explosion of submarine ordering by many countries just after 1900. Italy, Austria, Holland, Portugal, Sweden, Norway, Peru, and even Japan. France ordered 4 more submarines in 1900 and budgeted for another 39. Russia went shopping for 14 Holland submarines in the States. There's another American inventor called Lake. They went after 4 of his 450 tonners, his Protector class, and a further 4 boats from Krupp in Germany, and another 10 of their own design. Now, at this stage, there was no reason for Britain to need submarines just because rival navies had them. Because at this time, the submarine is not effective in an anti-submarine role. Stick pinging's not been invented, and when you're underwater, you're blind. So you can't find an underwater enemy. So actually, the logical defence for a navy like Britain was to build a large class of anti-submarine destroyers to lob depth charges into the water. But the Navy decided they would have to buy and at least test submarines just to get operational experience of how they worked. So the Navy realised that the old Nordenfelt designs were outdated, so they had little option but to actually buy 5 of the 67-foot Holland boats from the United States, from their old enemies, the IRA. These were built under licence by Vickers at Barrow. So this is the famous picture. You may well have seen this one. It's been in many, many naval history books. This is the Royal Navy's first submarine, Holland 1, in 1901. So it's interesting the Royal Navy's first submarine is named after an Irish dissident. They're distinguished by their extremely low conning tower, which is an extremely bad design feature because you can imagine once this thing gets underway, you only need waves of about 3 feet, and you're not going to be able to see anything out the conning tower because the waves will be breaking over it. Not a good idea. All very streamlined, but not much use, especially in the North Sea. Now, these are powered by vertical 4-cylinder petrol engines, and here is one. Now, this prototype you saw in the picture a minute ago has been found and raised and preserved, and you can go and walk around it and inside it at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum at Gosport. It's a great treasure. So here's the 45 horsepower petrol engine, which stands a bit higher than a man. Now you'll notice there's no internal divisions here. This is a completely open inside hull, so they've made the same design, basic design error that World War I tanks did. You've got this noisy, extremely hot, carbon monoxide emitting, because the joints aren't quite sealed on the exhaust, machine right in the middle of the crew compartment instead of stuck in a separate box at the back like it should have been. So these vessels can't have been very pleasant to work in. There's a single bow tube at the front with 2 reloads available. And Captain Bacon was appointed as the first inspecting captain submarine. Now, here she is preserved at Gosport, and at the time when she was raised, I remember this well, she became a huge national advertising campaign for the patented rust inhibiting system called Furtan. It was the largest use of Furtan for anything at the time. Now, these boats were soon found to have inadequate speed, only 7.5 knots, inadequate range, only 350 miles, not terribly good if you're a global superpower, and inadequate seakeeping. So Bacon and Vickers quickly designed a larger 200-ton system called the A Class, and they were successively followed between 1904 and 1910. I'm not going to show pictures because it will take too long. By the B Class, 11 of those, 38 of the C Class. Now they're now using 16-cylinder petrol engines being made by Vickers under licence. The Vickers monopoly was broken. 6 of the C Class were built at Chatham Dockyard, which introduced this hybrid building programme where both the dockyards and the private sector are building things. And these submarines get parcelled out as part of coastal defence systems all the way from Portsmouth to Dundee. Now during this period, the famous Sir John Jackie Fisher, Battleship Fisher, becomes First Sea Lord for the first time. You may remember he had a rather checkered career where he was out in the grass for a bit and then brought back in. So this is our super dreadnought man, okay? Right, he was a keen supporter of submarines, despite being a designer of battleships, in the teeth of fierce opposition by the whole of the rest of the naval establishment. He said far-sightedly in a letter of 1904, "In all seriousness, I do not think it is even faintly realised the immense impending revolution which the submarine will effect as a weapon of war." How prophetic. A big step was taken in British design between 1908 and 1914 with the twin-screw D&E class. They were the first British diesel-powered submarines and were therefore much more economical and far less dangerous than the petrol engines. And the diesel engines remained the power source of choice for all non-nuclear boats ever since. Operational reliability was increased by having twin screws, and the surface range vastly increased to 2,500 miles, and the underwater endurance to 14 hours, which is 70 miles worth. So that's the capability to remain submerged throughout an entire daylight patrol period, which is quite an operational advantage. The E-Class, built just after the Titanic disaster, was the first set of submarines to have watertight internal bulkheads. What a good idea. Now, the damned un-English doctrine of attacking merchant ships on the open seas had still not emerged, but they were felt to have a role in strategic coastal blockade of enemy ports. So overall, this programme had given the Royal Navy a fleet of 77 submarines at the start of World War I. Now, meanwhile, Germany had started from nothing in 1899, due to opposition by Admiral von Tirpitz, but galloped forward in the next 10 years. Now, of course, Germany had access to the diesel engine, having been invented there, MAN and all that. So MAN and Augsburg are absolutely key to the development of the German submarine fleet. So at the start of World War I, the stage is set for the emergence of the K Class. So let's have a little look at Royal Navy politics between 1905 and 1915. Many history books tend to give the impression, with 2020 hindsight, that engineering development of warships or anything else is a logical progress in an obvious direction. Nothing could be further from the truth in British armed forces. There were often violently opposing views of the best way forward. Now, by their very nature, the senior military ranks are full of very bigoted men with powerful egos and well-developed combative natures. So nothing is easy. There's a strong tendency of reaction to perceived new threats by the enemy, sometimes based on faulty intelligence and scare stories. How topical if we go back a few years of weapons of mass destruction. Right, but in 1914 we had yet to learn from Germany by bitter experience the real potential strategic role of the long-range attack submarine against merchant shipping and strangling the lifeline of an import-dependent country such as Britain. In all, U-boats were to sink nearly 8 million tonnes of Allied shipping in World War I. Now, Fisher had been forcibly retired in 1910, but this did not silence him. In 1912 and again in 1914, he warned that enemy submarines might attack British merchant ships in wartime, this is before war's been declared of course, without warning. Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, replied in public that he did not believe this would be done by a civilised power. As soon as war started, Churchill recalled Fisher to office at 73 as his deputy, and Fisher was appalled to find there were 4 fewer active submarines in the Navy, 64, than when he had been retired, with only 17 of them capable of open sea operation, and there had been no worthwhile technical development, just mainly due to total hostility from the rest of the naval establishment. This was despite the obvious evidence that Germany was spending over £750,000 per year building a strong force of long-range overseas submarines, literally hundreds being produced by Krupp's. Was through 1911 to 12, Britain did not produce a single new submarine design, while German, French, Italian and even Danish yards were making rapid technical progress, including the high-powered diesel engines. So eventually, the flag officer, Keyes, invited both Vickers and Scotts to offer new original designs for long-range overseas submarines. The Vickers design was twice the size of the largest E-Class in service, with a range of 3,500 miles, and the Scott design was a bit smaller. But they indicated that they could not guarantee the reliability of the large Fiat diesel engines which they built under licence, and suggested using steam turbines instead. Keyes, the officer in charge, immediately seized on this remark. He made a telling statement. "We viewed with misgivings the much more powerful diesel engines needed to propel the Vickers oversea. We welcomed, therefore, with relief the introduction of such a simple and well-tried means of propulsion as the steam turbine. The first fateful step towards the K Class had been made." Of course, well-tried steam turbines were one thing. Incorporating boilers and large funnels and huge combustion air requirements into a vessel capable of diving was something else again. But maybe Keyes did not have sufficient grasp of boiler engineering to appreciate this little detail. So Keyes ordered one prototype of each type. The Vickers boat was named Nautilus, and the Scott vessel was called Swordfish. Here she is underway. A second step followed shortly afterwards. The Chief of Naval Construction proposed a much larger steam-powered vessel weighing 1,700 tonnes and 338 feet long. The proposed surface speed was 24 knots, which was 9 knots faster than any existing submarine. The Admiralty rejected the proposal at the time on the grounds of manoeuvring difficulties and the perceived difficulties with steam propulsion. So when Fisher returned to office in October 1914, Swordfish here was only half complete and having endless technical difficulties. Now, the Royal Navy had a very rude awakening to the potential of the submarine in World War I. On the 1st of September 1914, a U-boat penetrated the defences in the Firth of Forth, the boom defences, and sailed up as far as the railway bridge. This generated spurious U-boat sightings, false ones, by the lookouts in Scapa Flow, and a panic response by Admiral Jellicoe, in which the entire Grand Fleet left its supposed safe haven in Scapa Flow and retreated to Loch Ewe on the Scottish west coast for a very uncomfortable 17 days. A month later, it happened again. This time, Loch Ewe was regarded as unsafe, and so the entire fleet retreated to Loch Swilly in Northern Ireland. Hardly a good start to a war by the world's greatest and supposedly impregnable battle fleet. Meanwhile, on the 5th of September, a U-boat successfully torpedoed the British destroyer flotilla leader Pathfinder in the Channel. On September the 22nd, U-9 sank 3 British fast cruisers, the Abakir, Hogue and Cressy, the latter 2 while they were picking up casualties from the first one, leading to a terrible loss of 1,460 crew. This dastardly deed gave the lie to Churchill's early hopes of chivalry and gave a chilling introduction to total war. This catastrophe led to the immediate banning of all daylight ship movements in the Channel. Nevertheless, U-9 continued its killing spree by sinking another cruiser, the Hawk, with the loss of another 500 lives. Now, the size of the German U-boat fleet was also overestimated by intelligence in London. It was known that they'd commenced a construction programme of 72 long-range submarines in 1912. What they didn't know was that only 28 of them were actually in service. But Fisher himself supported the rumour that there were 46 of them active. Even the naval intelligence took seriously a very silly rumour that Germany had managed to build another 200 in secret. Churchill's response to the situation as First Lord was swift and abrupt. He wrote to the newly reappointed Fisher, "Please propose without delay the largest possible programme of submarines for delivery in 12 to 24 months. Assume that you have total control of all sources of manufacture and that steam engines can be used to supplement the diesel engines. We must be satisfied that the absolute maximum output is to be worked to in submarines." And this was obviously a massive knee-jerk reflex, but would be absolutely useless in defending the battle fleet against German submarines, because a submarine can't find each other underwater without ASDIC. Nevertheless, Fisher flung himself into this new task with fanatical energy. Within 48 hours, he held a huge meeting with all his submarine commanders, all the top Admiralty design officials, and he opened the meeting by telling the Superintendent of Naval Contracts in front of everybody else that, quote, he would make his wife a widow and his house a dunghill if he brought any paperwork or red tape into the business. A sentiment which I heartily endorse. I just wish I had ever had the seniority at work to issue an order like that. Only 1 week later, there was a big conference with all the private shipbuilding representatives, which by the end of that day had produced 38 construction orders. 12 for the proven E-Class design, a further 10 of the proven American H-Class from Bethlehem Steel. No wonder that Jackie Fisher was such a legend. At this stage, he carefully ignored Churchill's heavy hint about steam power, because he could foresee the problems of retracting boiler funnels. On the operational front, the scare rapidly amplified. Serving officers on surface warships started reporting remarkable surface speeds of German U-boats, one even claiming 22 knots. The most critical incident occurred on the 1st of January 1915, when the battleship Formidable was sunk with a loss of 547 crew. The key issue was that the surviving officers, trying to cover up a clever ambush by a slow U-boat, claimed that the U-boat had kept pace with the ship on the surface in a North Sea gale. This was utter nonsense, but unfortunately they were believed. Fisher ordered the Director of Construction to design a submarine capable of at least 20 knots so that it could keep up with our surface warships. The officer responded by proposing steam turbine drive, because no British diesel submarine design could exceed 15 knots. Fisher refused. His anti-steam prejudice had just been reinforced by an incident a week before. A small steam-driven French prototype, the Archimede, which looks very much like Swordfish here, had been involved in an unfortunate incident. His vessel had been on loan to the Royal Navy and was taking part in an operation with a line of 6 other British submarines in an attempt to ambush Admiral Hipper's cruiser squadron in Heligoland. They were returning from bombarding Hartlepool. A gale blew up, and the large waves bent Archimedes' funnel so much it could not be retracted. As a result, seawater poured into the boiler room via the funnel, and she spent 2 days limping home to Harwich, kept afloat only by a human chain bailing party. So Danecourt responded with a different design, which was a 21-knot diesel design using 3 big 12-cylinder engines. This became the J-Class, and 8 of them were actually built by naval dockyards. Meanwhile, many senior naval officers were still besotted with the obsolete visions of great fleets of battleships running in line, shelling each other, like in Nelson's time. They kept pressing Fisher for a fleet submarine design, as they called it, one fast enough and with enough range to accompany the Grand Fleet on its worldwide forays, at the routine speed of 21 knots to act as a surprise weapon. Needless to say, all these scares about high-speed German U-boats led them to believe that the German fleet already had such a capability. This really is weapons of mass destruction stuff, isn't it? Now, Keyes unfortunately shared this dream. In reality, with the primitive means of communication to and from submarines at this time, and the complete absence of anything like ASDIC, the concept was downright dangerous. Trying to manoeuvre submarines alongside battleships, as we will see. And now, there is something from Keyes' private diary. He conducted an exercise at a scaled-down speed of 14 knots to test the concept of working submarines with battleships. And he confessed privately to his diary afterwards, "I had some very bad moments. watching heavy ships, cruisers and destroyers manoeuvring in all direction over the submarines, and for some hours I was in mortal fear that one of them had come to grief. Now this were small, highly manoeuvrable submarines at the slow speed of 14 knots. But of course the official report described the exercise as a success. In the very first month of the war, they tried this concept for real. They put submarines with a group of British cruisers attacking German ships in the Heligoland Bight. The results were near disastrous. The submarines 3 times mistook British ships for the enemies and fired torpedoes at them, which fortunately missed. One torpedo narrowly missed the cruiser Lowestoft. In return, the 3 British cruisers mistook the British submarines for U-boats and tried to ram them to sink them. Fortunately, all these attempts were so useless that no damage was done by anybody. Remarkably, Keyes claimed afterwards to his superiors, these submarines have proved that they could be trusted to work in cooperation with surface craft and to take care of themselves. Not my analysis of the situation. Anyway, in February 1915, the friction between Fisher and Keyes came to a head, and Keyes was banished to the Dardanelles. Fisher appointed in his place Commodore Sidney Hall, who had already commanded the submarine service under Fisher back in about 1910. Unfortunately, both these men began to crumble for the pressure from Churchill and the admirals to support a fleet concept. So within 2 months, Hall had to admit to Fisher that the diesel-powered J-class could now only guarantee 19 knots, which was 2 knots too slow to work with the battle fleet. Fisher maintained that a guaranteed speed of 21 knots was vitally urgent. The Grand Fleet must have them no matter what the cost. So Vickers was consulted, and they said the only option was to go for steam turbines. So Daincourt's previous 1913 steam turbine paper exercise was dusted off. The tightly confined boiler room, already like a sauna even during surface cruising, had to be sealed off during a dive as it rapidly became too hot to be inhabitable, which I think would probably have happened on Garrett's Resurgam as well. Thank goodness Vickers incorporated the idea of a communicating passage down the outside of the boiler, a bit like those corridor tenders on A4 Pacifics, so as to avoid cutting off the crew completely into 2 halves underwater. The proposed armament had originally been 2 deck guns and 8 21-inch torpedo tubes. These were replaced with 3 guns and 10 18-inch tubes, the extra 2 of them in the funnel casing for use on the surface. Anyway, Fisher sanctioned 4 of these monsters. In 1915, Vickers' price offer of £300,000 each was accepted at a time when a large destroyer cost £130,000. 2 boats were ordered from Vickers and 2 from Portsmouth Dockyard, and the K Class was born. But Fisher had already gone. He resigned in May in protest in a huge row with Churchill over the ill-fated Dardanelles operation. As soon as he was gone, 10 more of the K Class were ordered. 3 from Vickers, 3 from the dockyards, and 2 each from Armstrong, Whitworth and Fairfields on the Clyde. Between September 1915 and May 1916, with the K Class still under construction, news came in that this fella, the experimental prototype Swordfish, was still experiencing numerous difficulties, such as condensation short-circuiting the main switchboard, flashbacks in the boiler, and an alarming tendency to roll during diving. So let us have a look at a K-Class boat. Here is one. She's 339 feet long. That's the length of a cruiser. It displaces 1,800 tons on the surface, which is larger than a contemporary destroyer, and 2,600 tons submerged. This is over 3 times the displacement of the next largest submarine in the Royal Navy surface. The hull is divided into 9 watertight compartments, which was going to prove extremely fortunate later on. There were 45 different ballast and oil tanks, a plumber's nightmare. Now you can see the long, narrow superstructure. So there's a generously sized 2-man conning tower forward. My mouse has died. But as you can see, it's got rather small portholes. Now the retractable funnels, they're 5 foot high. They have watertight covers. And in addition to those retracting, there are 4 37-inch diameter telescopic mushroom-shaped air vents. The funnels were retracted via a very ingenious hydraulic mechanism we'll come to in a minute. So here's a view of the main propulsion compartments. So you can see where the conning tower is there. The boiler section is here. That's the boiler room, with pairs of Yarrow water tube boilers facing each other, a typical fowering row, as in the Titanic, say. You've got the two retractable funnels above. Here's the steam turbine machinery there. There's two compound turbines, and their shafts drive through large electric motors. So the motors are already mounted on the same shaft, so it's a compound drive system. And these fellas here are beam torpedo tubes. So it can fire from the beam as well as... This is the funnel retracting mechanism, which is quite ingenious. It's got a rotary hydraulic motor over here, driving a gear drive train, a reduction train. So there's various gearboxes, one of which drives these levers that swing the funnel down into this compartment in the superstructure, and then another mechanism swings over this big mushroom dome from the top. So you are expecting something about over 3 feet diameter, plus two of those, and 4 mushroom-shaped vents of about similar size, to seal perfectly every time, full of barnacles, seaweed, and goodness knows what. And if any one of them fails once, there will be a problem. Right, now the twin main shaft propulsion system has been stretched to its limits. So let's have a look. Oh, here's the funnel retraction process first. Here's it going for real. This is the early stage of the process. And we proceed through. The funnels are gradually being retracted until it's trimmed down like this, ready for diving. And this is a later one on the class K15. And you can see now the bow has grown a little bigger. They put on what they call swan bows because the original bows proved to have inadequate buoyancy and they tended to dive and dig into the bottom. Let's have a more detailed look at the engine room, and I want to immediately draw your attention to the way the compound steam turbines have been crammed in. They've literally used every inch of space they've got for the turbines and the gearboxes, which just incidentally creates a major safety problem for the engine crew. There's not a lot of space to move around these machines, and there must have been a maintenance engineer's nightmare. Now there's a combining gearbox there, and then these are electric propulsion motors directly on the shaft. And here is the vital feature, the emergency backup diesel machine. It's a diesel generator, but it does allow you to provide power for the electric motors underwater independently of the steam turbines. So it's steam turbines for surface, diesel-powered electric for underwater. But the fact you've got a diesel engine independent of the steam system is an awful good idea. Now, in addition to that, you can see there's lots of things like compressed air storage bottles in rows. So there's very little room for the crew to move here, and it must have been extremely hot. Now, the steam is provided by Yarrow water tube boilers. This is the one being loaded into that prototype Swordfish at Scotstoun Greenock. I couldn't find a single picture anywhere of an equivalent operation for K-boat. And there's pairs of those facing each other longitudinally in a very compact boiler room. One significant mercy for the sweltering stokers was at least they were oil-fired. You can only imagine what the working environment would have been if they'd used coal, as in the earlier 1900 submarines. Now, the water tube boiler, the Babcock design, and this one, the Yarrow design, had recently decisively triumphed in the Navy's so-called Battle of the Boilers trials between 1899 and 1902 over Scotch boilers, and it was a close-run thing because there'd been extremely poor performance with French Belleville water tube boilers before these designs came along. So on each shaft, we have a 5,250 horsepower compound geared steam turbine set. This is the one for K15, which we saw externally a second ago. The boilers were built by John Browns of Edinburgh, by the way. Now, these are of either Parsons or Brown Curtis designs. So there's the Parsons machine, and there's the Brown Curtis one. And again, these were the only photographs of these we could find. They've never been published, as far as I know. Mm-hmm. What, the first one? Well, it's labelled as Parsons on the original print. It's certainly obviously different from this machine. We can talk about it afterwards. You can come and have another look in more detail. Right. Yeah. And then there's an 800 horsepower, 8-cylinder diesel engine on the centre line, as I showed you. And there are pairs of 700 horsepower DC motors on the drivetrain. So this gives you a 10-knot diesel-electric air-breathing surface propulsion mode before you use batteries once you're under. So it's extremely valuable for getting underway when you surface while you're raising steam. When you put on a steam submarine, you come to the surface among the enemy, and in a battle situation, how long is it going to take you to raise steam before you can move? So it's rather useful having a diesel system. Okay. Now, there are 4 new features this class has introduced. The first thing is their ridiculous length. It makes them almost unmanoeuvrable. You've got something longer than a cruiser, and you're expected to be able to dive in a lake or an estuary. well, you know, the water depth is significantly less than the length of the vessel, so you don't have to get your angle very long and you will dive the bows into the bottom. Firstly, the vessel is so large, there's a crew of 53, it is no longer possible to shout at people within hailing distance, so we're having to use voice pipes for the first time to get at the more distant members of the crew. Previously, most submarines have been small enough for direct eyeline. But the most important thing, of course, is this novel funnel retraction system. We've created 6 additional large hull breaches. Too many damn holes, as somebody said at the time. These would have to work perfectly every time, even in rough sea conditions. The bad experience with the Archimede bending its funnel in 1914 did not bode well. Finally, in battle conditions, the steam system imposed a much longer closing down procedure prior to dive of 4 minutes, compared to 30 seconds for diesel classes. This could be a critical delay if you were spotted by an enemy on the surface. The K Class appears to have been the unluckiest class of warship ever built for the Royal Navy. There are so many incidents, it's really quite difficult to know where to begin. K3 was the first in service. She suffered excessive boiler room temperatures and a nasty tendency to dig her bows into a head sea, even during her first sea trials in mid-1916. Later, diving in Stokes Bay off Gosport in 150 feet of water, with the future King George VI on board as a junior officer, K3 plunged her bows into the bottom mud and was stuck for 20 minutes with her propellers thrashing in the air. Fortunately for the future of the monarchy, he never set foot in a K-boat again. In January 1917, on patrol in the North Sea at 10 knots, a sudden broadside wave crashed down the funnels and put out the boilers. The vessel wallowed broadside with still more water entering, and by the time she'd been manoeuvred into wind with the backup diesel electric set, the entire boiler room was knee-deep in water. K2, built in Portsmouth Dockyard, suffered a boiler flashback explosion, a fatal one, in its first diving trials, even inside the dock. As fire extinguishers had been omitted, the crew had to fight the fire with a human chain with buckets of seawater. Shortly after, in a similar diving trial in Devonport Dockyard, K6 trapped 50 men inside for 2 hours due to a fault in the ballast blowing system, leading many of the dockyard staff to blacklist further work on her. There's the propulsion motors. There's the diesel engine. And this is what happened to K4 early in her career. She ran aground on Walney Island during her initial sea trials due to the poor manoeuvrability and spent about a week on the beach. K11 shipped water down her funnels and shorted out the diesel generator. But now I want to talk about K13. K13 is the one we started the title slide with. This is a photograph of her doing her acceptance trials in the gale lock, proving that she can do 22 knots in January 1917. This is the most disastrous and famous failure of a single K Class submarine. She was built at Fairfields on the Clyde, and these incidents I'm about to describe took place on her acceptance trial in the gale lock on the 29th of January. It was to become one of the greatest sagas of submarine salvage in Royal Navy history. Fairfields had little experience of submarines, but they had completed this novel craft in 15 months. The day of her trial, she was carrying 53 crew, plus 14 officials and 2 officers from her sister ship, K14, and 1,100 other assorted civilians. Her experienced Captain Herbert, with 10 years of service, had already been in command of her working up period for 3 months. And the previous day, she'd completed 2 successful dives and had run a measured mile in the Clyde at 23.5 knots, which at the time was a world speed record, and this is a photograph of her doing it. Now, the third day started badly with a rope tangled round the propeller. Within minutes of setting out in the Clyde, somebody accidentally switched off the starter panel of the electric steering gear, disabling the helm. She swung round in the tide and buried her bows in a mud bank. The ebbing tide soon dragged her stern around until she was crossways across the Clyde, blocking the way. A steamer unfortunately tried to run the gap between K13's stern and the following bank and became briefly wedged between them. K13 then ignominiously reversed herself off the mud bank, and this resulted in an unglorified stern first visit down the Clyde until there was enough width to turn properly. She then completed her surface run trial off Greenock and then moved into the gale lock for her driving trials. A first shallow run went okay, but the engineer lieutenant reported at the end that 200 gallons of water had leaked into the boiler room, an ominous sign. Because of the intense heat and steam in the closed-off room, he had been unable to trace the source of the leak. Back on surface, he checked the 4 big mushroom air vents and felt that one was, quote, sticking a little. During the lunch on the tender vessel, he had the stokers go and recheck the vents and was informed it was okay. So Herbert then started the second and final dive test with 80 people on board. He signalled on the surface to a second submarine, E-50, which was also on trials that day. 2 visitors, the civilians, were in the engine room as the dive started, and they spotted that the ventilator indicator light, the ventilator closed light, was flickering. They independently quizzed the engineer about it and were told it was just a small wiring problem. And nevertheless, he sent a junior engineer to see if the, quote, nuisance leak was recurring. This youngster soon shot back to warn that the entire boiler room was flooding rapidly through the ventilators. Within seconds, it was too late. Despite blowing all the forward balance tanks and dropping the 10-ton emergency keel, K-13 rapidly settled by the stern in 55 feet of water. The incident was right opposite a waterside hotel. One of the junior maids, having a break outside, saw a great bubbling in the water, then 2 human heads bobbing around who cried out once and disappeared again. When she rushed in to tell her story, she was patronised as a young female and not believed. Much later, it would be discovered that the missing men were the engineer lieutenant and one of the boiler engineers, who must have attempted a free-rise escape from the engine room hatch. Only one of these men was ever found. As soon as K-13 hit the bottom, large jets of water spouted from the voice pipes from the engine room into the control room and shorted out the main switchboard. The crew had to desperately fight the fire and high-voltage sparks with pieces of clothing and bare hands because there were no fire extinguishers, while burning cables critically polluted the breathing apparatus, the breathing atmosphere with dense smoke. The telephones from all the rear compartments were silent. The 49 men back there were already dead. Due to a deadly lack of foresight in design, the rear emergency drop keel and half of the vital tank-blowing compressed air cylinders could only be operated from within the now flooded engine room. Also, remarkably, in view of their vital role in incidents of this kind, the inner watertight bulkheads that had been so carefully provided were only designed to take 15 psi pressure difference, i.e. 30 feet of water. At 55 feet, they were being subjected to 25 psi with the unpleasant potential to burst suddenly at any time and drown the remaining crew, a fact that was well known to all the officers. Despite the obvious risk, Herbert ordered them to draw off some of the breathing air into high-pressure storage cylinders, both to reduce the pressure on their eardrums and to conserve it for later. They tried to send the underwater distress signal using a thing called the Fessenden transmitter. It failed. Unfortunately, they had dived in the last hour of daylight on a short Scottish January afternoon, which meant that their sinking might not be discovered until 7 a.m. the next day, 16 hours away. That is, if the air, the bulkheads and the bilge pumps all held out. But Professor Hillhouse, the chief designer from Fairfields, gloomily calculated that based on the amount of oxygen available, the accessible supply would only last for half that, 8 hours. Then there was the added hazard of carbon dioxide accumulation, which makes controlled body actions near impossible for a human at near 5% concentration. Hillhouse also did a set of calculations which confirmed that even if they succeed in blowing all the ballast tanks to which they still had access, K-13 would not rise. So these men were staring an agonising slow death in the face under only 55 feet of water. They might as well have been the other side of the moon. Fortunately, the captain of E-50 nearby was a sufficiently careful observer to recognise the unusually large air venting from K-13 during the dive. So after a while, he got in a dinghy and rowed over to the spot and noticed streams of bubbles and small streaks of oil still rising. So as darkness fell at 4 p.m, the disaster call went out to the naval and Fairfield facilities, many miles away up the Clyde. At this stage, there was no submarine self-escape apparatus for the use of the crew, or an airlock hatch. And surface salvage facilities were limited and slow to respond. Diving suits were still only available in limited numbers. In terms of rescue, the 55 feet of water above them might as well have been 300. The Fairfields director and the senior officer reached the Garelock by car at midnight. 2 naval salvage tenders with heavy lift cables were en route. A small Navy gunboat had arrived. It carried a diving suit but no diver. Fairfield's own diver was sent for by car and arrived at 4 a.m. but the old diving suit immediately burst and he was nearly drowned. The car was sent back all the way to Fairfields to collect another one. At daybreak, the same young driver, with great bravery, donned the replacement suit and fortunately came straight down onto K13. He was able to tap and receive simple Morse code signals through the hull. Herbert and the visiting Captain Goodhart decided that they had to get the message to the surface that the crew urgently needed breathing air now. Somehow the divers seemed unable to understand their Morse signals through the hull about this. So they hatched a desperate plan to modify the piping in the upper part of the cooling tower to turn it into a rudimentary airlock so that Goodhart could escape to warn the rescuers while Herbert stayed inside and worked the valves. On the surface, the Navy wanted to try and raise the bows by a lifting cable and rescue people through the forward torpedo tubes. But Fairfields, who were still technically the vessel's owners because she hadn't been handed over, feared she would break in half or at least be overstrained and permanently damaged. So they wanted to fabricate and fit an escape tube onto the torpedo loading hatch, but that would take several hours. The senior naval officer eventually pulled rank and told them to get on with a chain salvage. But it was now midday, 20 hours since the sinking. Just as the winches took the strain for the cable, a huge air bubble broke the surface above K13 and a man appeared in it. But it was not Goodhart. It was Herbert who was working the valves. He'd been helplessly blasted out of the upper hatch by the escaping air. Goodhart's body was found much later, wedged under the conning tower. But at least the vital message about the breathing air had got through. Submarine E50 by Providence was carrying a spare high-pressure air hose. It was hooked onto the compressed air cylinders and the diver went down to fix it to an emergency coupling on K13's hull. But in the limited visibility, he couldn't find the nozzle. The crew inside assumed from the available evidence that both the men in the conning tower had been killed and that their urgent air supply needs were still unknown. The diver outside the hull could clearly hear the repeated hammered Morse signal, "Give us air." The afternoon dragged on in futility until they had been stranded over 24 hours, 3 times longer than the professor's calculation. By now, despite the secrecy surrounding the K-Class, the Clyde shipyard's grapevine had been working overtime and a huge crowd had gathered on the shore to watch. At 6 p.m, in darkness again, the diver finally managed to connect the compressed air hose, but nothing happened despite 2,500 psi air supply pressure. Eventually, after 7 precious hours, they disconnected the air hose for examination and found it to be blocked full of solid ice in the freezing water. By the time it was reconnected, fresh air entered the submarine. It was now 35 hours since it went down, and by a miracle, none of the crew had yet died that were still alive in the compartment. They then turned the 2,500 psi into blowing all the ballast tanks they could get at, and slowly K13's bow began to lift. 37 hours, the periscope broke surface, but with the torpedo tubes 8 foot below the surface, they stopped the lift to fit a 4-inch hose to a small ammunition hatch to pass down food and water. But the dazed men inside, who could hardly breathe, were unable to understand the repeated messages to open the hatch on the inside. They had another problem. A submariner's nightmare is seawater reaching the batteries and generating deadly chlorine gas. The officers devised a batch-wise system for draining the seawater out of the compartment by letting water into a small tank and then blowing it out with compressed air. Finally, on the 3rd day, the crew finally understood the message to open the food hatch. And they were overjoyed to hear, "This is Captain Herbert speaking." A bottle of brandy was passed down the hose. Rescue seemed minutes away. At 11 a.m, a bottle they were trying to feed down became wedged in the supply tube. Soon after, the main switchboard blew and they were all plunged into darkness. Eventually, at midday, the top of the bow finally broke surface. Just as the torpedo tubes critically cleared the surface, K13 began to slip back out of the slings. Prompt action on the cables prevented it slipping any further, but further lifting was an end. They decided the only approach was to physically cut a hole in the top of the hull. This was an act of desperation because if K13 slipped back, it would flood immediately, killing everybody. K13's jinx struck again. Only seconds after starting the cut, fire broke out on the boat carrying the acetylene cylinders and ruined the gas supply equipment. A second set had to be brought all the way from the Clyde. By 2 p.m, a hole had been cut in the thin deck to give access to the pressure hull, but this lay through a free-flooding top compartment, which was just below water level. The valves controlling the flooding were inaccessible. They were inside K13. So for over an hour, the salvage crew tried bailing this compartment out by hand with these valves open. They started cutting the pressure hull. The hole in the deck was now only 6 inches above water level on a rising tide. Thank God the water was calm. At 9 p.m, the survivors began to come out to huge cheers from the boatswain on shore. As the last officer emerged, it was 57 nightmare hours since K13 had gone down, one of the longest successful rescue attempts in British submarine history. This is the memorial, and this, now the sinking was 1917, this memorial was only put up in the 1990s, which I found quite shocking. Now we're going to go big, we're going to look at what's called the Battle of May Island. Dramatic though the sinking of K13 was, the K-Class had an even more dramatic incident up their sleeve. It was to become a notorious incident within the Navy and was then diligently covered up, both in official documents and outside. I have a quotation from the training manual of the time. The K-Class have become successful vessels. In fleet exercises, they always fulfilled the functions for which they were designed. Well, let's see. This is a realistic, full-scale, nighttime battle exercise, EC1, in the North Sea, off the Firth of Forth. It's the 1st of February 1918, and this is the lineup of the ships leaving Rosyth and heading up the shore. So we have cruisers and large battleships, and then I've highlighted the 2 groups, each of 6 K-Class submarines with their escorting cruiser. It's the group at the front we need to concentrate on. Now, these 2 flotillas now had some of the most experienced captains in the submarine service. The massive exercise involved an attacking force coming down from Scapa Flow, pretend Germans, led by Beatty himself, of 26 battleships and 13 cruisers. And they would meet the defending force, this one, coming out of Rosyth, with 3 battleships, 22 cruisers, 9 submarines, and numerous destroyers. So this was the K-Class's big opportunity to prove their worth as a fleet weapon. It was 2 days after the first anniversary of the sinking of K13. And here she was, now carefully renamed K22, bringing up the rear of the 1st Squadron. All was going fine until they came to May Island. Now, this was at night and in radio silence. Now, unfortunately, somebody had forgotten to tell the mine-sweeping trawlers that regularly swept mines being laid by German mine layers in the Outer Forth. So, the initial group suddenly finds there are trawlers in their way. Sorry, I'm having difficulty with the mouse here. So there's the trawlers there. So they have to make a course correction. As soon as K14 turns, her helm jams. So she's wandering off in completely the wrong direction. The helm frees after a bit and she turns back on course, but not before K22, which is the original K13, off course, rams her. 7:15 p.m. The other 3 vessels are now on course again in the right direction, but they're a mile north of where they should be. The flotilla leader in the cruiser Ithuriel takes the fatal decision he's going to turn round and go back to help. This is at night. The only visible sign of a K-boat, which is only just above the waves, is a single tail light about the size of a car headlight at the back of the conning tower. This is radio silence. Well, they have to break radio silence to warn about the U-turn, but it took 20 minutes for the coded radio message to be deciphered by its recipients. So, more mayhem. Here's K11 here, and here's K17 hitting the bows of Fearless, bringing up the 2nd Squadron of submarines. Several of the other K vessels stop. A track of destroyers screening the battle cruisers run through them, while meanwhile a group of battle cruisers here is fortunately passing by just without hitting them. Then it gets worse. All the submarines start changing course in the darkness. The vital radio message that some of them are proceeding in the opposite direction has not got back to the ships coming forward. K4 and K6 collide. K7 avoids K6, which is already sinking, which is not sinking, it was damaged, and physically runs over the hull of K4 as it sinks. K3, thank God, stops. K12 manages to see this mayhem is going on and takes emergency operation. But K17, struck by Fearless, reels away and sinks. And that is what Fearless looked like the next morning. Even now, the drama had not ended. Large capital ships were coming up behind and roared past this melee in the darkness. Boat crews from Fearless spent a futile hour trying to locate other survivors. Fearless here has a 20-foot hole in her bows. All that day, searching continued. Not a trace was found from K4. 3 days later, the Court of Inquiry started its 5-day run. 5 officers, all from the submarines, were blamed for the disaster. The captain of K22, ex-K13, was unfairly blamed and severely reprimanded as a convenient scapegoat for the collision with the cruiser Inflexible, despite the fact that at the time his submarine was stationary, holed, and standing by a crippled K14, and displaying a full set of lights. But it would not do to blame BT's battlecruiser officers. Okay, so just to wrap up, the madness had not quite finished. Oh, there's a group of them at a depot ship. They lasted until about 1925, and then the class was quietly scrapped. There were some ridiculous experiments. They turned 3 of them into what they call the M class. So this is M1 with a single 12-inch gun, which can only be fired once. So you better get your aim right when you surface. That's the officers on board. E.F. Clark, the past president, this is his father in one of these pictures. There it is exercising off Portland. That sank mysterious off Portland. It was not found for many years. Its wreck has been found in recent years with several of the hatches open. Oh, now I haven't got a photograph of M3, unfortunately. M2 became an underwater mine layer, and M3 was converted to have a seaplane hangar and launching ramp on its rear deck. M3 was run over by a Norwegian cargo ship off Start Point when it was just below surface. They knew they'd run over something, but they assumed it was a dead mine or something. So when they got to their home port in Scandinavia, the ship was dry docked, and there was a nice streak of bright green paint, which was M3's camouflage colour, right along her hull. When divers eventually found M3 in the 1990s, the seaplane hangar main door was open, and so were several of the hatches through the main hull. Oh, I forgot to mention about M1. M1 was spotted going down. A trawler captain was overheard in a local pub asking if submarines usually dived stern first. And then finally, the French were messing around with Surcouf here in 1929. You think they'd have learned. So this has got a steerable gun turret and with 2 8-inch guns and a seaplane hangar. Fortunately, this one survived, amazingly enough. But after the M1 disaster, the Navy scrapped all the remaining K-boats. So a great, inglorious chapter in naval submarine history had closed. Now, the misguided fleet submarine concept, which had caused so many deaths, was finally discredited and abandoned in 1925. The Royal Navy wisely did not put air-breathing boilers into a submersible ever again. But this was far from the end of steam below sea. In 1954, the world's first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, was launched, propelled by steam turbines more powerful than the K-Class designers could have dreamed of. After all, a nuclear reactor is nothing more than a glorified, rather inefficient boiler, raising little superheat. The Rankine steam cycle, in its Parsons turbine form, remains the prime method of turning heat into useful shaft power throughout the world's thermal and nuclear power stations. And in both its ballistic missile and attack variants, the steam-powered submarine is today the most powerful naval weapon system on the planet. The balance of terror between these nuclear submarines has maintained peace among the superpowers for over 50 years. So as the progenitor of large steam turbine submarines, perhaps in a strange way, the K-Class crews did not die in vain. Thank you. Have we got a minute for questions, or are we holding turf down?
Right. I told you he'd got quite a lot to say. Actually, there is still a little bit of time for questions, so I'm sure people have got comments and questions. There are a couple of roving microphones.
Can we talk afterwards? You obviously know quite a bit about this.
There are a couple of roving microphones. I'd like, if possible, for you to get hold of one of those before you start asking questions so that we can all hear.
Chris, was there anything you wanted to ask?
I'd like a word later.
Oh, certainly, sure. Well, we can correspond by email and so on.
So, any hands raised? Yes, there's one right at the very top, the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting lecture, but you was mentioning about the number of people that was killed in these disasters. How many people actually did die?
I couldn't actually establish a total head count. It's something approaching 400.
And how many were killed in the K-13?
Oh, here you are. Is the man who knows. 323. Hmm? Yeah. 104 in one night at the Battle of May Island.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Down.
And according to the learned gentleman here, two torpedoes found in anger. One of which did hit its intended target, even if it didn't sink it.
I've got the lights in my eyes a little
Yeah.
bit, but so if anybody
Did you have a question yourself?
is waving, and
Sure, please. Yeah,
can you just wait for the microphone? It's
just coming.
That's right. Just helps other people to hear.
Yes, sir.
Excellent talk, so thank you very much. And I didn't mean to be disruptive
No,
before.
no, not at all.
Just thought I'd throw a couple of
Yeah,
things in.
please.
Just a couple of extra interesting points. So during the Battle of May Island, the future Lord Louis Mountbatten was on board K6.
Right. I hadn't realised he was in a submarine.
Yeah.
I thought he was in one of the cruisers.
And not only was the red light on the conning tower the only way you could see anything, it had blinkers on. So if
To stop
moved,
you couldn't see it from
if
the
you
side,
moved more
yeah.
than 11 degrees either
You
side,
didn't see it. That's, thank
everything
you,
was
yes.
gone.
Extra little
And
detail. Thank you.
the rescue message that is sent by Morse code was encrypted.
Yeah.
So the key thing about May Island was there was rumours of a U-boat just out waiting for them.
Yeah.
So they were normally going at 16 knots, and they were told that as you get near May Island, go to flank speed of 21, so
Yeah.
the U-boat couldn't attack. So they were going absolutely flat out.
Flash out.
But the last little bit I would add, if I may, is just the final part. You know, when the 4 battle cruisers came through with
Yeah.
the sweeping destroyers, there were 56 crew in the water. I've forgotten the K number,
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
K17.
K-17, I think, yeah.
But there were 56 in the water. The ships didn't hit, the capital ships didn't hit any submarine. Unfortunately, the men were cut to pieces by the propellers, and only 8 of them actually came out after that. It was absolutely tragic.
Oh, boy, I've stunned them into silence.
You
This
have,
is amazing.
you have. Well, there's one down at the front here. Just
You mentioned the air and problems with ears.
Yes.
There's no problem with ears. Sorry, I speak as a
Yeah,
submariner
sure.
and anaesthetist.
Yeah.
The problem is entirely entirely air pressure and rising partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the like. The ears, you pop your ears exactly the same as in a plane or diving. There's no ear problem at all.
Thank you. I find it quite extraordinary the length of time these people survived in K-13. You know, it's amazing there was anybody left to rescue. Apparently, the air in the main control room was visibly black when they were finally rescued.
They probably survive because of the rising pressure, because the partial pressure of oxygen will be rising.
Indeed so, of course. Yeah.
Now, it will bring the carbon dioxide up, and
Yeah.
carbon dioxide is actually a reasonably useful anaesthetic.
Quite.
So it's
Yes.
fog the fit of the
Yes, it would have affected their operational efficiency, like understanding the Morse code and that kind of thing.
rising pressure.
Yeah.
And those calculations to do with rising pressure are part of the Navy's sort of calculations as to how long
Yeah.
a submarine on the bottom
Yeah.
can stay, and you extend the time on the bottom by letting the pressure go up.
Oh, right.
And you're looking at bend incidents and things like
Yeah.
that, particularly if you go in with free escape.
Now, of course, the Russian Kursk disaster in recent years shows us that this is still not entirely a done deal, escape from submarines. You know.
Although it has been done,
We still have learning curves to climb.
we have learning curves down. We have done it down to 600 feet.
It's quite an achievement.
On bottoming a submarine
Yeah.
in Norwegian field. Although the preferred way to do it now is with a DSRV,
Of course, yeah.
vehicle. And I've actually been in 3 submarines on one dive.
Oh, have you now? Oh, I'll talk to you afterwards. There can't be many people in the audience who've done that, and I certainly haven't. Wow.
right. There's one there.
Today's submarines cost millions of pounds to build.
Certainly.
How much did it cost in them days?
Oh, well, the cost I gave, it was 300,000, and that was 3 times the cost of building a destroyer at the time. Hardly surprising, since you're building something the length of the cruiser with some very high-tech kit in it.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And under emergency conditions, the fastest you can possibly build it, irrespective of cost. Please.
So not only was our cost in that sort of order, I mean, I accept your word for it.
Well, that's
The interesting thing is the guys who supplied turbines, of course, there was only Parsons and Brown Curtis who could do it.
Indeed so.
And they charged an exorbitant license fee. I don't have the license fee
the order books were rather full of turbines for surface ships at the time.
Yep, but so the license fee for putting Parsons turbines into a battleship, a dreadnought, was £1 million.
Oh, wow.
At the time during the Battle of Jutland, I mean, basically 80 to 90% of all fleets, the German and British ships, all were Parson powered, nearly with a proportion Brown Curtis.
Indeed so.
And the German, I mean, we only supplied until 1914, but the German government came in about 1914 and said, for God's sake, stop putting the Parsons turbines in, because £1 million a ship was absolutely bankrupting them.
Defence procurement doesn't change, does it?
Right. I think we probably ought to draw things to a close, unless there's anybody that's got anything very desperate they want to ask.
You can always come and see me privately.
So thank you very much. Most fascinating, and to have the good history of the submarine up to it as well, I think was a bonus. So it's a fascinating story, and it would be great fun if it wasn't so tragic, I think.
Indeed so, yeah. Sure, so as you probably gather, I'm a little bit emotional about
yes.
parts of the subject.
But anyway, thank you very much indeed, and let's just say thank you to Chris in the usual way. I've got one little announcement to make at the end, but perhaps I'll just ask Jim Ranahan just to tell us about next month's meeting and other little housekeeping things.
Thank you. Mike Potts will be talking to us next month, the early history of the Newcomen engine, and that's on Wednesday the 2nd of March at 7 o'clock here. I need to remember to thank Chris, the technician. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
And just to say that we're retiring to the Woodman across the road afterwards if you want to join us. If you haven't signed in on the registration form at the front, please do. It does help us to demonstrate the attractiveness of our lectures. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. The only announcement I just wanted to make before we go is just to mention that Gordon Long, who was a member of the branch for many years, from 1954 to 2004 or thereabouts, apparently has recently died aged 95. He used to prepare summaries of our lectures for the quarterly bulletin. His executors wonder if anybody would be interested in his many books on technical subjects. If anyone wants to follow this up, please talk to Jim Andrew, who's got a little bit of not much detail about what they are, but we'll tell you a bit more about it. But some good technical books potentially available, but as I say, I'm not sure if there's a full list of them at the moment, but ask Jim if you're interested. Right, thank you very much for attending. Hope to see as many as possible at the March meeting, and have a good month in the meantime.